No, please, don't take him. I love him.
Silence! I warned you both. Take him to the black cells.
The chains were the first thing anyone heard. Not the boots of 6 royal guards striking the marble in unison, not the doors slamming open, not the voices of ministers cutting themselves off mid-sentence. It was the chains, iron links dragging across the grand floor of King Alaric's throne room, that brought the hall to complete silence in the space of 3 heartbeats. Every person in the room had a different reason for going still. The ministers went still because of protocol. The ladies went still because of shock. The senior generals went still because they had both seen enough to know, in their bones, when a situation had crossed past the point of easy reversal. The young man at the center of all of it walked without stumbling. He was in a palace guard's uniform, plain gray wool, brass buttons, no rank, no embroidery, and his hands were bound in front of him with a bruise forming along his left jaw, and the 6 armed men flanking him could have forced a faster pace, but were, perhaps, aware that it wouldn't look well to drag a man who was already walking. He kept his head level. He looked forward. He did not glance at the nobles staring from either side of the aisle, and he did not glance at the throne. And when Princess Seraphina broke from her ladies-in-waiting and ran into the room, he heard her and did not turn. "Father, please, he has done nothing wrong. If you must punish someone—" The king raised one hand. Seraphina stopped. The guard stopped too, not because the king's gesture was directed at him, but because the procession halted when the princess entered its path. And in the sudden stillness, he finally turned toward her. She was close enough that she could see his face clearly. What she saw in it was the thing that stayed with her for the rest of her life, because she had expected many things: anguish, rage, fear, the desperate, searching expression of a man running out of time, and what she saw instead was none of those. He looked at her the way he had always looked at her, with the unhurried attention of a man who had made a decision and was now simply being present for what it cost. "Seraphina," he said quietly, "whatever you're about to say, don't. I won't let them. I already said what needed saying." He held her gaze for one long moment. "You taught me that by watching you. The right thing doesn't become less right because it costs something." The guards pulled him away. The great doors opened. The iron sound faded down the corridor. The doors closed, and the princess stood in the middle of the marble floor, surrounded by an entire court, with the echo of those last words still in the room, trying to understand what he had meant. She didn't know yet, but she had heard it, and she would not forget it. And in the days that followed, she would understand, fully, completely, without any room for doubt, exactly what kind of man had just been taken from her. This is where the story ended for everyone watching. This is where it truly began. 17 weeks earlier, in the kingdom of Kingswell, a mother sat at the bedside of a dying king and watched her only son stand at the window, staring at a country he did not yet know how to rule. Queen Evelyn of Kingswell had spent 30 years learning to read the silence of the people she loved. She knew the difference between the silence of a man at peace and the silence of a man who was afraid of the wrong thing. Her son, Prince Lucian Valcourt, heir to the throne of Kingswell, had the second kind. He was not afraid of ruling. He had been prepared for that since birth. He was afraid of becoming the kind of ruler who wore the crown like armor instead of carrying it like a responsibility. And he was afraid that the only way to find a wife worthy of standing beside him was a way that the law had not anticipated. The law of Kingswell was very old and very clear. No coronation could take place without a queen beside the king. His father was dying. The physicians had stopped pretending otherwise. The coronation would need to happen within months. And every daughter of every noble family in every neighboring kingdom already knew his name, his title, his land, his treasury, and the precise shape of the crown he would one day wear. They had known all of it since before he could walk. "There is no one in any royal court," Lucian said quietly, without turning from the window, "who would look at me and see only a man. They would see a throne first. Always a throne." His mother did not argue with him because she knew he was right. "Then go somewhere," she said, "where no one knows the throne exists." He turned. "Go as yourself," she said, "not as the prince, as the man you are underneath the title. Find honest work. Live the ordinary life you've never been permitted to live. And if you find someone—" She paused. "Choose the woman whose heart is the same, whether she is standing in a palace or a cottage. Not the woman who becomes kind when she learns you are a prince. The woman who was already kind before she knew." He left before sunrise 2 days later. No ceremony, no announcement, a leather saddlebag, a change of clothes, a few gold coins in a plain purse, and a single item he carried always, but told no one about. A signet ring, the seal of the House of Valcourt, hidden in the inner pocket of his riding coat. He did not know why he brought it. He told himself it was habit. He did not examine the possibility that some part of him feared losing himself so completely in the disguise that he would need a reminder of who he was. The kingdom of Everley was 3 days' ride to the east, across open farmland and 2 low mountain passes. Lucian crossed into it on a gray morning when rain was threatening and the border guards barely glanced at a man in plain traveling clothes on an ordinary horse. The capital, Velmoor, was a working city. Merchants and craftsmen and sailors and students crowded the streets in a way that Kingswell's more restrained capital never quite managed. Nobody noticed him. Nobody bowed. A woman at a baker's stall nearly knocked him sideways, reaching past him for a loaf of bread, and didn't stop to apologize. He stood in the middle of the street and felt something he did not immediately have a name for. Free, he thought finally. This is what free feels like. He found a room above a cobbler's workshop and spent 3 days asking around the harbor and the marketplace for any honest work that paid enough to live on without drawing attention. The palace, someone finally told him, was hiring additional security guards. The position paid modestly, required discipline and a clean record, and came with meals and a shared barracks room. He applied under the name Lucian, just Lucian, no family name. The guard captain who interviewed him was more interested in whether he could ride and whether he could hold a sword than in where he had come from. "You've had training," the captain said, watching Lucian demonstrate a standard defensive stance. "Yes, sir." "Where?" "Private instructor. My employer's family believed in preparedness." The captain studied him for a moment. Then he handed him a uniform. "Be at the eastern courtyard before sunrise tomorrow. Don't be late." The first week was an education in a way that no palace tutor had ever managed. Lucian stood in line for breakfast with stable grooms and kitchen apprentices. He was assigned to night patrol 3 times in the first week, and discovered that the corridors of a royal palace in the small hours of the morning sounded nothing like they did during the day. Smaller, colder, more honest. He learned the names of every permanent staff member on his patrol route because it was the courteous thing to do, and because he quickly noticed that none of the senior officers bothered to. He learned that the cook who prepared the guards' meals had a daughter with a serious illness, and had been quietly skipping her own lunch for months to put aside money for a physician. He left extra coins near her station twice without leaving a note. On the 14th morning, he was assigned to accompany the royal inspection procession to a cluster of farming villages west of Velmoor. Standard security detail: 4 guards, 2 officials from the treasury, and Princess Serafina. He had seen her once before, at a distance, crossing the palace courtyard with her ladies-in-waiting. He had registered what everyone registered at a distance. She was the king's daughter. She was reportedly kind, and she was currently the object of considerable political interest from a prince named Cedric in the neighboring kingdom of Thornfield. That was everything he thought he knew about her before the morning of the inspection. By noon, he knew considerably more. The procession reached the first village, a place called Hawthorne Crossing, just as the market was setting up for the day. Serafina stepped out of the royal carriage before any of the footmen could assist her, smoothed her coat, and walked directly toward the oldest man she could see, the village elder, who was standing slightly apart from the welcoming crowd with the careful stillness of someone who had learned not to reach for things that weren't offered to him. "Good morning," she said, reaching out her hand first before he could bow. "I've heard you had flooding here last spring. I want to see what's been repaired and what still needs attention. Will you walk me through it?" The man blinked. Then he smiled, slowly, like a man who had stopped expecting to be asked his opinion by anyone and had just been reminded what it felt like. "Yes, Your Highness, of course." Lucian watched from a respectful distance. Later, near the edge of the market, he watched her notice a group of children standing apart from the stalls. 4 of them, wearing clothes that were too thin for the autumn chill, watching the food with the particular careful blankness of children who had learned not to want things out loud. Serafina said something quietly to her steward. The steward nodded and moved away. Within minutes, a palace attendant was distributing bread, cheese, and cups of warm broth from the supply carriage. The children didn't understand at first what was happening. Then a small girl with red, chapped cheeks reached out and took a piece of bread and looked up at the princess. And the princess smiled at her the same way she had smiled at the village elder, like the child was exactly as important as anyone Serafina had ever met. Lucian thought about that smile for the rest of the day. The moment that changed everything, though, came in the afternoon, outside a stone building on the far side of the village that served as a market hall during the week and a gathering place on Sundays. A palace official. Lucian had learned the man's name was Administrator Breslow, second-tier treasury oversight, known for speaking to junior staff the way a person might speak to a slightly inconvenient piece of furniture, was in the middle of loudly berating an elderly woman who worked as the hall's caretaker. The woman had apparently failed to have the building unlocked on time for the inspection. She stood with her shoulders hunched, a ring of keys clutched in both hands, while Breslow's voice rose in the open air of the courtyard for all 30-odd villagers nearby to hear. "Do you understand?" Breslow said, enunciating each word with the practiced patience of someone who had learned that contempt sounds more refined when it is slow. "The difference between the arrival of a palace inspection and the arrival of your morning baker. No. Then perhaps that is why you were given responsibility for a building and not anything more significant." The woman's face had gone very still in the way that faces go still when a person has decided that dignity requires them to stop reacting. Lucian's hand moved toward the hilt of his short guard's blade, a reflex, and then he stopped himself, because that was not his place, and he knew it. He did not need to act. Serafina had already crossed the courtyard. She positioned herself between Breslow and the caretaker. Not loudly, not dramatically, simply by stepping into the space between them until Breslow either had to acknowledge her or physically move her. He stopped speaking mid-sentence. "Administrator Breslow," Serafina said pleasantly. "The key is there now. The inspection can proceed." She paused, just long enough for the pause to mean something. "I'd like you to wait by the carriage, please. I'll manage the rest of this visit." Breslow opened his mouth. "Thank you," Serafina said, in the tone of a person who has already finished the conversation. He left. Serafina turned to the caretaker, and Lucian watched her entire manner shift. Not performed warmth, just the actual thing. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly. The old woman straightened slightly. "Yes, Your Highness. I apologize for the delay." "Don't!" Serafina reached out and briefly covered the woman's hands with her own, the ones still clutching the keys. "You've kept this building for how long?" 31 years, Your Highness." 31 years, Serafina repeated, softly, like she was recording the fact somewhere important. "Then you know where everything is better than any of us. Will you show me around?" Walking back to the carriage 2 hours later, one of the other guards fell into step beside Lucian. "She's always like that, you know," the man said, with the easy familiarity of someone who had been on many such inspections. "Never different when there's an audience versus when there's not. I've seen her stop an entire royal procession to help an old man who'd lost his dog." Lucian said nothing. He was thinking about the ring in his inner pocket, and about his mother's words, and about the particular quality of a person who is exactly the same whether anyone is watching or not. That evening, returning to the palace, the procession passed through a narrow village gate, and Serafina's carriage hit a rut in the road. The carriage door swung open. Serafina, who had been leaning against it reviewing notes, lurched sideways. Lucian was riding closest to the carriage door. He reached across without thinking, catching her arm, steadying her. She grabbed his forearm in return. For a moment, they were both still, close enough that he could see the exact shade of her eyes in the late afternoon light. Then the carriage righted itself. He let go. She looked down at his hand as she pulled back, and he felt it the same moment she must have felt it. The hard edge of the signet ring pressing through the cloth of his inner pocket, catching against her fingers as she released him. He saw her eyes register it, see the shape of it, recognize, in the way an educated person trained from childhood in heraldry would recognize, the distinctive outline of a royal seal. She looked up at him. He looked back at her. She said nothing. She smoothed her coat, settled back into her seat, and turned her attention to her notes, as though nothing had happened. The carriage rolled on. Lucian rode beside it in silence. His heart was beating at a pace that had nothing to do with the jolt in the road. She knew. He was almost certain of it. And she had chosen, in that moment, not to say so. He did not know what to do with that yet. He only knew that it was the most remarkable thing he had seen all day, and the day had already contained a great deal. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Lucian's life. He had spent 26 years learning to exist in a world where his name preceded him into every room. Here in Velmoor, in the gray wool of a palace guard's uniform, he walked through corridors and marketplaces and village roads as simply himself. And the experience was not as simple as he had expected, because being simply himself turned out to require more attention than being Prince Lucian Valkcourt ever had. He learned, for instance, that he had strong opinions about how public disputes should be handled that he had never previously been allowed to act on. He learned that he laughed more easily than he had realized. He learned that he was better at listening than at speaking, which several people in his life had attempted to tell him without success, and which he only now believed because there was nobody around with a reason to flatter him. And he learned that Princess Seraphina of Everley did not treat him differently after the evening of the rut in the road. She was not cooler toward him. She was not warmer. She asked him, on the next inspection, the same kinds of questions she had asked before, about the villages they passed through, about what he had noticed, about whether he thought the bridge on the North Road was as sound as the engineers claimed. She argued with his assessment of the bridge. She was right, and acknowledged it when the engineers confirmed her view, and then suggested without any fanfare that the guard captain who had agreed with Lucian should perhaps be included in future consultations so that the disagreement could be useful rather than simply settled. She was, Lucian thought, the most practically intelligent person he had met in his adult life, and he had spent considerable time around people who were considered intelligent. He did not tell her who he was. She did not ask. This was the agreement they had reached without ever speaking it aloud, and it held for 3 weeks, and then 4, and then 5, and in the 5th week, things began to change in the way that things change when two people have been carefully not saying something for long enough that the silence becomes its own kind of conversation. They began talking on the long roads between villages, not about anything significant at first. He asked her about the northern provinces. She asked him about his impressions of Velmore versus the capital cities of kingdoms he had allegedly visited as part of previous employment. He was careful and honest about everything he said, except the parts that would have required him to explain the ring. She listened carefully and asked follow-up questions, which he had noticed she did with everyone. But there was a quality to her attention when she spoke with him that was slightly different from her attention when she spoke with treasury officials or village elders, and he was aware of it, and he suspected she was aware of it too. In the 6th week, walking back to the carriages through an apple orchard at the edge of a village called Millhaven, she said without preamble, "The man you work for, before Everley, what happened to him?" Lucian considered the question. "He's ill," he said. "Seriously, I needed to be away for a while before things changed, and I couldn't leave." She was quiet for a moment, walking beside him with her hands loosely clasped behind her back, the way she walked when she was thinking carefully. "You left someone ill to come here and work as a guard." "I left someone ill to try to find something before it became too late to look." She looked at him sideways. "Did you find it?" He kept his eyes on the path ahead. "I think so." She did not respond immediately. An apple fell from a branch somewhere to their left, hitting the ground with a small, decisive sound. "I hope," she said eventually, very quietly, "that whatever you find here is worth what you're paying for it." It was, he realized later, the closest she had ever come to acknowledging what she knew. He thought about that sentence for 3 days. Prince Cedric Thornfield arrived in Velmore on the first cold morning of autumn. He arrived the way powerful men arrive when they want to establish something immediately, with 40 horsemen, 6 ornate carriages, a herald who announced his procession from the city gates inward, and gifts sent ahead to the palace the previous evening, so that the court would have spent the night handling them and thinking about him. Lucian was part of the honor guard stationed at the main palace entrance when the procession rolled in, and he watched Cedric Thornfield descend from his carriage with the particular ease of a man who had rehearsed arriving. Cedric was tall, handsomely built, and dressed in a way that was expensive without being ostentatious. Someone had given him excellent advice about the line between displaying wealth and performing it. He smiled at the assembled court with the warmth of a man who had also received excellent advice about smiling. He was, Lucian recognized immediately, the kind of person who was very good at appearing to be everything he had been told to appear to be, which was not quite the same as being it. At dinner that evening, a formal welcome feast from which the guard staff were excluded, but not invisible, since someone had to stand at the doors, Lucian watched. He watched Cedric watch Seraphina. And he watched Seraphina's face during the moments when Cedric was watching her. The slight, controlled stillness she maintained, the way she answered his questions with perfect courtesy, and not one word more, the way she changed the subject each time it drifted toward the engagement that both their courts had been quietly negotiating for months. She was polite. She was gracious. She was present in the room in the way that a person is present in a room when they have decided, with full deliberateness, to give nothing away. Cedric was watching her the same way Lucian was watching Cedric. 3 days after his arrival, Cedric summoned Captain Aldrich Fenn, the commander of Lucian's patrol unit, a man who had been guarding the Palace of Everley for 11 years. A man Lucian had come to trust because he was efficient, fair, and had never once in 11 weeks asked Lucian a question he wasn't supposed to ask. Lucian did not know about this meeting. He found out about it later in the worst possible way. He had been assigned to a night shift in the corridor outside the Royal Library, a quiet post that mostly involved standing still and listening to rain against the windows. Near the end of his shift, as the palace was beginning its slow stir before dawn, footsteps approached from the direction of the East Wing, measured, unhurried, the footsteps of a man who had already made a decision and was now simply moving toward its execution. Captain Aldrich Fenn rounded the corner with 2 of the royal household officers behind him. He stopped when he saw Lucian. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Lucian looked at his captain. He saw something in the man's expression that he had not seen there before. Not guilt exactly, but the specific quality of a face that has already moved past the point where guilt would have been useful. The decision had been made. The door had been crossed. What was in front of him now was simply the next step. "Captain," Lucian said. "I need you to come with me," Fenn said. His voice was the same voice Lucian had heard give 11 weeks' worth of orders. Calm, professional, without inflection. "There are questions the king wishes answered." "What questions?" Fenn met his eyes. "About your conduct." Lucian went very still. "My conduct." "Regarding the princess." Fenn paused. "Not long. Just long enough. I've provided the king with a detailed account of every occasion on which you have spent time alone with Princess Seraphina, outside the bounds of your assigned duties. The dates, the locations, the duration. It made for a fairly substantial document." Lucian understood. Not gradually, all at once, the complete shape of it. "You were watching us," he said. "I was doing my job," Fenn said. "You were watching us for someone else." Fenn said nothing. "How much?" Lucian asked. The question came out very quietly. Fenn's jaw tightened slightly. "I've done nothing illegal. Prince Cedric expressed concerns about—" "How much?" Lucian said again. Silence. And then, because Lucian needed him to say it, because some part of him needed to hear the actual, honest version of this conversation with his own ears. "You've been the most fair officer I've worked under in 11 years of various postings. I told 2 men I thought you were worth trusting. I said that last week." He paused. "I need you to know that I know what you did." Fenn looked at him. For one brief moment, something shifted in the man's face. Not regret, not quite, but the acknowledgement that the thing he had just done had a true name, and that name had been spoken aloud. "You are to come with me," Fen said. Now, Lucian went. They walked through the palace in the grey hour before sunrise, and the floors were cold, and the chandeliers were unlit, and Lucian's hands were steady because he had decided, somewhere in the corridor outside the library, that whatever happened next, he would not pretend it was not happening. He would be exactly who he was. He did not have time to think about the ring. He did not have time to think about what it would cost to tell the truth, and what it would cost to withhold it. He only had time to think about his mother's words. Choose the woman whose heart is the same, whether she stands in a palace or a cottage. He thought about a princess stepping in front of a woman being publicly humiliated and asking her, afterward, how long she had worked there. He thought about what he was about to do. He walked into the throne room. The dungeon beneath Kingswell Palace, beneath any palace, was not designed for comfort. And the dungeon beneath the royal palace of Velmore had not been used in over a decade, which meant that nobody had thought to do anything about the smell or the water that collected in the low corner of the cell furthest from the door, or the fact that the single torch in the corridor outside was too far from the barred window to provide anything more than the suggestion of light. Lucian sat on the stone floor with his back against the wall and his chained wrists resting on his knees, and counted the footsteps of the guard who walked the corridor every 40 minutes. He knew it was 40 minutes because he had been counting his own heartbeats between each pass, and he had a good sense of his resting heart rate, which was approximately 60 beats per minute, which meant 2,400 beats, give or take, between each set of footsteps. He had nothing else to count. The first day passed this way. No food, as the king had ordered. A small jug of water delivered through the slot in the door at what he estimated was mid-morning. He drank half of it and saved the rest. He had learned during one particularly arduous military exercise in his 16th year that the instinct to consume available resources immediately was the instinct most likely to cause serious problems later, and he had no way of knowing when the next jug would come. He did not sleep easily the first night. The cold of the stone moved through his clothes within the first hour, and there was nothing to use as insulation, except the jacket he was wearing, which was not enough. He spent the early part of the night doing controlled movements to keep his temperature up. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would attract attention from the corridor guard, just slow, systematic exercises designed to maintain circulation. After a while, exhaustion won over discomfort. He slept. He dreamed about his father's study in Kingswell, about the way winter light came through the high windows in the late afternoon and fell in long strips across the old stone floor, about sitting at the small table by the window with his father, reviewing documents, sometimes in silence for an hour at a stretch, because his father had believed deeply that silence between two people who trusted each other was not empty, but full of all the things that didn't need saying because they were already understood. He woke to darkness and to the sound of the corridor guard's footsteps, and he lay still for a while, staring at the rough ceiling, and let himself think clearly about his situation. There was no version of this that ended well if he remained silent. He had known it before they brought him here. He had walked into the throne room with his hands already accepting what was coming, and when the king had asked him whether the accusations were true, he had said yes, because they were, because there was no world in which he was willing to stand in front of an entire court and deny that he loved Seraphina. It would have been the easiest lie he had ever told. It would have resolved the immediate problem. It would have required him to be, in that moment, exactly the kind of man the disguise was supposed to protect him from becoming. So, he had said yes, and they had brought him here. He turned the problem over in his mind, the way he had been trained to turn strategic problems over. Look at all four sides. Look at what you have. Look at what you're missing. Look at what the opposing position actually requires. What he had: his own name. The ring in his coat pocket. Still there, he had checked. The guards had not searched him thoroughly enough to find it. And the knowledge that his mother would eventually send someone to find him when he failed to return within the expected window. What he was missing: any way to get a message out of this cell, any way to know what was happening above him, and, most acutely, any way to know what Seraphina had done when the throne room doors closed behind him. What the opposing position required: Cedric needed the king's continued cooperation. The king needed Cedric's financial backing. Both of them needed Seraphina's compliance. None of those things were guaranteed. And Seraphina. He had thought, the first night, that she would find a way to reach him. Not through the dungeon. He was not naive about the access restrictions, but through a letter, through a message passed to one of the guards, through some signal that she was still in the fight. On the second day, when no message came, he revised his assessment and told himself that she was being watched too carefully. On the third day, when the silence remained complete, he found himself doing something he had not done in years, trying to convince himself of something he did not quite believe. "She loves you," he told himself. "She showed you who she was before she knew who you were, which means the character you fell in love with is the character she actually has. You have seen her be kind when kindness cost her something. You have seen her stand between harm and a person who couldn't protect themselves, and the person she protected did not matter to her position or her future. That is not performance. That does not change." He stopped. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes and made himself stay with the honest version of his thoughts. She had said nothing when she recognized the ring. She had asked him, in the orchard in Millhaven, whether what he was looking for was worth what he was paying. She had been, for 6 weeks, the most careful and deliberate person in his vicinity. And she was a princess who had been trained since birth to balance the personal against the political, to measure what she wanted against what was possible, to understand, more acutely than most people ever had to, that the decision she made in any given moment would affect not only herself, but an entire kingdom's worth of people who had no say in her choice. What would a woman like that do when she discovered that the man she had been quietly loving was a foreign prince currently in her father's dungeon on her account? He did not know. He thought he might be afraid of the answer. The water jug came and went on the third morning. The torch in the corridor guttered sometime around midday and was replaced. The corridor guard changed shifts twice. Lucian sat with his back against the wall and his chained wrists on his knees and tried not to think about what was happening above him, and thought about it constantly anyway. He thought about his father, who was dying, or had perhaps already died, in a palace 3 days' ride to the west. He thought about the ancient law of Kingswell that said no king could wear the crown alone. He thought about the look on Seraphina's face when she returned the vegetable basket to the elderly widow in the market at Hawthorne Crossing. Not performing compassion, simply expressing it, the way a person breathes without deciding to. He thought about what it would mean if she chose Cedric. Not the political dimension of it, not the alliance between Everley and Thornfield, not the financial implications, not the cold calculus of kingdoms. He meant what it would mean for the particular fact of her, the person who argued about bridge construction and remembered the names of village elders, and had known who he was since the 6th week, and chosen every single day after that to keep his secret as carefully as he kept it himself. If she chose Cedric, there were two possible explanations. The first was that he had been wrong about her, that the character he had observed over 11 weeks was in the end susceptible to the same pressures that had transformed Rosalie from a kind village girl into someone unrecognizable. That power and security and the promise of a certain future could erode even genuine goodness. The second was that she was choosing Cedric for a reason that had nothing to do with wanting Cedric. He sat with both possibilities for a long time. He did not know which was true. Far above him, in the eastern wing of the palace, Seraphina stood in front of her father's private study door and knocked 3 times. The king called her in. He was at his desk, not working. The papers in front of him were untouched. He was simply sitting, in the way that men sit when they are carrying something heavy and have nowhere to set it down. "Father," she said. She had rehearsed this. She had been up since before dawn rehearsing it, because she had known since the morning they took Lucian away, that the only argument that would work on her father was not an argument about love, but an argument about consequence, and she had spent 3 days building it carefully in her mind. She did not sit. "I want to discuss Lucian's release." "We have discussed it." "I want to discuss it again." She kept her voice level. "You have had him in the dungeon for 3 days with no food. You've made your point. The court has seen that you will not tolerate Seraphina. Eat what they perceive as an inappropriate attachment. The statement has been made. Continuing it past this point serves no additional purpose. He confessed to loving you in front of my entire court. I know. He is a palace guard with no name and no family. You have no idea who he is." The words came out more sharply than she had intended, and she stopped herself and started again more carefully. "You have made assumptions about who he is, and I am telling you, as the person in this kingdom who has spent the most time with him in recent months, that those assumptions are worth examining before you make a permanent decision." The king's eyes narrowed slightly. "What do you know about him?" She said nothing. She was not ready for that question yet. The true answer to it would change everything, and she needed to choose exactly the right moment for that change. "I know," she said instead, "that he is the most honest person I have encountered in this palace. I know that he has never asked me for anything. I know that every time I have seen him choose between the easier thing and the right thing, he has chosen the right thing." She paused. "I know that there is a man in your dungeon who does not deserve to be there, and that the reason he is there is because of me." The king was quiet. "Release him," she said. "Let him leave Everley. I will not fight you on the engagement with Cedric." The silence stretched. "If I agree," King Alaric said slowly, "then you understand what agreeing means. The engagement moves forward. No delays, no conditions." Seraphina's hands were clasped in front of her, and she pressed them together once, tightly, and then released the pressure. "Yes," she said. "I understand." Her father looked at her for a long moment. He did not look triumphant. He looked, she thought, like a man who had just won something and was already beginning to understand that the price was higher than the ledger showed. "Very well," he said. "He will be released by evening." She thanked him with the correct words, in the correct tone, and walked out of the study with her head exactly level, and made it all the way to the end of the corridor and around the corner before she stopped walking. She stood with her back against the stone wall of the corridor. in the place where no one could see her from either direction, and she let her breath come out slowly. She had promised herself she would not cry. There were no tears. There was only the sensation of something closing. A door, perhaps, or a window, or the cover of a book she had been reading and had reached the last page of and had to put down. He would be free. That was what mattered. She straightened her back, and she walked to her chambers, and she stood at the window and watched the lower courtyard in the fading light, until she saw, small in the distance, a figure in a guard's plain coat emerge from the palace's service entrance with nothing in his hands. He stood for a moment. He looked up at the palace, at the windows, at the upper floors, at the place where she was standing. She was behind the curtain. He could not see her. She pressed her hand flat against the cold glass. He stood a moment longer. Then he turned and walked toward the stables and disappeared into the evening. And she watched the empty courtyard for a while after he was gone, and the light continued to fade, and eventually the courtyard lanterns were lit one by a groundskeeper making his evening rounds, and the world continued on as worlds do, indifferent to the weight of small private sacrifices. Kingswell received Lucian the way a kingdom receives news it has been dreading, with black banners already hung, bells already silenced, and a queen standing at the top of the palace steps with the particular expression of a woman who has been holding herself together for days and is now allowing herself to stop. He had known before the messenger found him on the road. He had felt it, in the imprecise way that people who love someone deeply sometimes feel a change before the news arrives. A shift in the air, a sudden wait where there had been none, riding through mountain fog in the small hours of the morning with the certainty that something permanent had happened behind him. When the royal messenger appeared at a crossroads and said, "Your father," Lucian had already stopped his horse. He spent 3 days in Kingswell before allowing himself to think about anything except the funeral arrangements. His father had spent 30 years making Kingswell what it was. He deserved 3 days of his son's complete attention, and Lucian gave them, reviewing every detail of the state ceremony, approving the ceremonial procession route, ensuring that the foreign dignitaries invited to pay their respects would be received with full honors. It was on the 3rd evening, going over the invitation list with the Lord Chancellor, that he saw the name, Kingdom of Everley, Royal Delegation, King Alaric, Senior Ministers, and Her Royal Highness Princess Seraphina. He sat with that for a long moment. "Is there a problem with the Everley delegation?" the Lord Chancellor asked carefully. "No," Lucian said. "No problem." He told no one what had happened in Velmoor. He told no one about the dungeon, or the ring, or Seraphina's hand pressed against a window he had not been able to see through. He told his mother only that he had found someone and lost her, and Queen Evelyn, who had spent 30 years reading the silences of people she loved, did not ask for the parts he was withholding. "Is she coming?" she asked instead. "Yes." "Then the story is not finished," his mother said. He wanted to argue with her. He did not have the energy. The funeral of King Roland Valcourt was held on a morning of high, thin clouds and cold, clear air, the kind of morning that felt like the world holding its breath. The great cathedral of Kingswell could hold 3,000 people. It was nearly full. Every noble family in the kingdom, ambassadors from 7 neighboring lands, the foreign royal delegations in their formal mourning dress seated in the gallery reserved for visiting dignitaries. Lucian had not planned to look for her. He looked for her the moment he entered the cathedral and found her almost immediately in the 3rd row of the visitors' gallery. Seraphina, in deep gray mourning clothes, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes on the casket at the front of the hall. Not on him, on the casket, with the respectful attention she brought to everything. Fully present, not performing presence. He made himself look away. Beside her, in the same row, sat Prince Cedric Thornfield, impeccably dressed, with the self-composed expression of a man who was accustomed to being at important events and knew how to look appropriate at them. He was looking at Lucian. When their eyes met, Cedric's expression did not change. It simply became more deliberate, the way a face becomes deliberate when it has just received information it was prepared to receive. Lucian held Cedric's gaze for exactly the length of time required to establish that he was not looking away first. Then he turned his attention to his father's casket and kept it there through the entirety of the ceremony. When the final prayer ended and the assembled court began the slow movement of condolence, King Alaric was among the first to approach. Lucian saw him coming and waited. The king stopped before him and for several seconds said nothing at all, which Lucian had not expected. He had expected diplomacy, the careful language of sovereigns navigating an awkward situation. What he got was a father. "I owe you an apology," King Alaric said. "I put a man in chains without knowing who he was. I judged a person by the clothes he wore. I made a decision I believed was correct, and it was wrong. And I am sorry." Lucian looked at him. The king's eyes were not the eyes of a man performing humility. They were the eyes of a man who had spent several weeks sitting with what he had done and had not been able to escape it. "Your Majesty," Lucian said carefully, "I came to your kingdom under a false name. That is a fact. My reasons were genuine, but the disguise was real. You couldn't have known what you were doing." "I could have asked questions before I gave an order," the king said. "That is a thing any just man can do regardless of what information he has. I didn't." Lucian was quiet for a moment. "Then we were both imperfect," he said, "and we both know it. That is a reasonable place from which to begin something better." King Alaric looked at him, and something in the king's expression shifted. Not relief, exactly, but the recognition of a kind of character he had not previously expected to encounter here. Before either of them could continue, movement at the edge of Lucian's vision. Cedric Thornfield had crossed the hall floor and was now standing 3 feet away, with 2 of his personal advisers flanking him and the expression of a man who has decided that the moment for subtlety has passed. "Your Royal Highness." Cedric inclined his head just enough to be technically deferential, without being actually deferential. "I believe congratulations are in order. A man of your evident planning ability deserves acknowledgement." He paused. "Though I do find it remarkable, the lengths to which some men will go to make an impression on a woman." Lucian did not answer immediately. "I also find it remarkable," Cedric continued more quietly, "how a foreign prince who entered a neighboring kingdom under a false identity made contact with a member of the royal family under false pretenses, and conducted what any reasonable observer would call surveillance of the inner workings of the palace. I find it remarkable that such a man would feel comfortable showing his face in a public ceremony." He let that land. Around them, the hall had quieted in the way halls quiet, when people are pretending not to listen. "You're going to suggest," Lucian said, "that I entered Everley as a spy." "I'm going to point out that the evidence would support that interpretation." "The evidence would also support," Lucian said, "that a prince from Thornfield bribed a senior officer of the Everley Palace Guard to surveil a member of the Everley royal family without the knowledge or authorization of King Alaric. I imagine that interpretation would be equally inconvenient. He paused. For you. Cedric's eyes sharpened. You have no proof of that. Captain Fenn served Everley for 11 years, Lucian said. He is currently still employed there. He has a family. He made a choice under significant financial pressure. And that choice has been weighing on him. And the people who know him best will tell you that it has. He held Cedric's gaze. I don't need to prove anything. You and I both know what happened. The question is which version of events you'd prefer to have examined publicly. Silence. Cedric looked at him with something that was not quite anger and not quite respect, and might have been, if examined carefully, a very early version of understanding. You could have revealed who you were, Cedric said slowly. From the cell. You could have said your name and ended the whole thing in an hour. Yes. Why didn't you? Lucian looked at him directly. Because I wasn't going to buy my freedom with a name. Either I was worth releasing as the man standing in front of you, or I wasn't worth releasing at all. That's not a political position. That's a personal one. He let a brief silence settle before continuing. I'd suggest you take some time to consider whether the things you've built your future on could say the same. Cedric said nothing. He stood there for a moment that lasted longer than it needed to. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back toward the visitors' gallery. King Alaric exhaled slowly. That was remarkably well handled, he said quietly. He'll find a way to respond, Lucian said. This isn't finished. No, the king agreed, but the shape of it has changed. He looked at his son, his potential future son-in-law, his daughter's cause, with the expression of a man recalculating. What do you intend to do now? Lucian looked across the hall. Serafina had not moved from her seat. She was watching him, not pretending she wasn't, watching him with the steady, unhurried attention she brought to things that mattered to her, and he held her gaze across the width of the cathedral for a moment that felt longer than the ceremony had, and in that moment, everything he had been not saying for 17 weeks was visible between them. I intend, he said, to ask someone a question that has been waiting long enough. Cedric did not retreat quietly. That was the thing Lucian had known. Walking back from the conversation with the king, watching Cedric's advisors close around their prince with the rapid efficiency of men reassessing a position under fire. A man who had built his entire strategy on controlling the narrative did not simply absorb a reversal and withdraw. He regrouped. The regrouping happened that same evening. Lucian was in his private study, reviewing the coronation timeline with the Lord Chancellor. The law was unchanged, and there were documents to be prepared regardless of what happened with Serafina, when a palace steward knocked and entered with a message on official Thornfield stationery. It was addressed to both King Alaric and the Royal Council of Kingswell, and it was, Lucian recognized immediately, well constructed. Cedric had set the infiltration argument in writing. The document was carefully worded. It did not accuse. It raised concerns. It noted that in light of the recent revelation of Prince Lucian Valcourt's extended presence within the Everley Palace under a concealed identity, the Kingdom of Thornfield wished to formally request a joint inquiry by the councils of both kingdoms into the nature and extent of that presence, before any bilateral discussions between Kingswell and Everley regarding the princess proceeded further. It concluded by noting, with elegant regret, that the Kingdom of Thornfield's existing financial proposal, the one that would resolve Everley's treasury deficit, remained available, pending the outcome of such an inquiry. The timeline of the document was important. It had been drafted before the funeral, Lucian could see, The language was too settled, too prepared, to have been written in the hours since their confrontation in the cathedral. Cedric had always intended to play this card. The confrontation hadn't accelerated it, it had simply forced him to play it now instead of later. Lucian set the document down on his desk. "This is a problem," the Lord Chancellor said carefully. "It's a designed problem," Lucian said, "which makes it somewhat more manageable than an accidental one." He spent the night thinking through it. Not the political angles, those were clear enough, but the human ones. Cedric's letter placed Everly in an uncomfortable position. If King Alaric moved quickly toward any arrangement with Kingswell, it would look like he was trying to evade scrutiny. If he delayed, it gave Cedric's framing time to solidify in the minds of other kingdoms watching. It was a clean trap, built with care, and deployed at the moment of maximum vulnerability, right after a royal funeral, when everyone was exhausted and slightly off balance. The only way to dismantle a trap built on a false narrative was to replace it with a true one. In the morning, he sent a note to Captain Aldrich Fenn, not through official channels. Through a courier who had ridden from Velmore with part of the Everly delegation and was staying at an inn near the cathedral. The note contained 8 words. "I know what happened. I'd rather you speak first." He waited. By noon, he had his answer. Captain Fenn arrived at the palace in plain clothes, without announcement, and was brought to a small receiving room off the main corridor. He looked like a man who had been carrying something for several weeks and had become visibly lighter in the last 24 hours now that the option of setting it down had appeared. He told Lucian everything: the approach by Cedric's advisor, the amount offered, the documents he had been asked to compile, the moment, 3 weeks in, when he had realized that what he was doing had a different name than the one he'd been using for it. Lucian listened. He did not interrupt. When Fenn finished, he said, "Will you say this to King Alaric?" Fenn nodded once, the nod of a man who has already made up his mind and is simply confirming it out loud. The meeting was called for the following morning. Both royal councils. Cedric Thornfield and his advisers, present as guests at the funeral, and therefore subject to the protocols of royal hospitality. King Alaric, who had been informed the previous evening and had spent a night that Lucian suspected had not involved much sleep. And Lucian, who entered the room in his mourning clothes, with no ceremony, and sat in the chair offered to him as a visiting royal with the particular calmness of a man who has decided not to perform anything. Cedric was already seated. He did not look at Lucian when he entered. Fenn spoke for 20 minutes. He was precise. He named the date, the amount, the instructions he had received, and from whom, the report he had compiled, and to whom he had delivered it. He answered questions from both councils with the composure of a man giving a truthful account, which is a very different composure from the composure of a man giving a rehearsed one. When he finished, the room was quiet. Cedric's senior advisor leaned toward him. Cedric shook his head slightly. "Prince Cedric," King Alaric said. His voice was not angry. It was something more difficult to face than anger. It was tired, and it was certain. "Is there any part of Captain Fenn's account that you dispute?" A long silence. "No," Cedric said. The word landed in the room, and nobody moved. "Then I think," King Alaric said, "that the inquiry you proposed in your letter last evening is now unnecessary, since the matter it was intended to investigate has been clarified by the testimony just given." He looked at Cedric steadily. "Your delegation will be received with the full hospitality owed to a guest at a state funeral, and you will depart Kingswell at your earliest convenience. The matter of the financial arrangement between Everly and Thornfield is herewith withdrawn from consideration." Cedric looked at the king. He looked at Lucian. He looked at the table in front of him. He was, Lucian thought, a man who was accustomed to winning, and he had not lost in a long time. And losing had come for him in a form he had not prepared for. Not through force, not through counter-manipulation, but through the simple appearance of the truth in a room where there were enough people willing to recognize it. "I see," Cedric said. He stood. His advisers stood. He inclined his head to both counsels, the precise, correct angle, no more. He looked at Lucian once, very briefly, with an expression that Lucian could not quite name. Not contempt, not quite, and not concession exactly. Something in between. The look of a man filing away a lesson. Then he left. The door closed behind him. Lucian remained at the table while the two counsels proceeded through the formal notes and the necessary follow-up items. He answered questions when asked. He was precise and clear and said nothing that wasn't required. But part of his attention was somewhere else, in a corridor outside this room, or perhaps in a garden somewhere, or on a road. When the counsels finally dispersed, King Alaric stayed behind. "She didn't know," the king said without preamble. "I want you to understand that. She did not know who you were when any of this happened. When she came to me in the study and made her offer, she was protecting a palace guard, not a prince." Lucian looked at him. "I know." "I'm not sure you do." King Alaric picked up his gloves from the table, turned them over once in his hands, set them down again. "She told me, before she agreed to anything, that it didn't matter. She said the question of who you were born as was irrelevant to the question of whether it was right to leave an innocent man in a cell." He looked up. "I want you to know that I heard her say that, before I told her yes." Lucian was quiet for a moment. "Thank you for telling me." He found Seraphina in one of the palace's smaller gardens, a walled courtyard with old rose brambles and a stone bench that caught the afternoon sun. She had come here, he learned later, because she had needed to be somewhere that was not a formal room, somewhere that had no protocol attached to it. She was sitting on the bench with her hands in her lap, not doing anything, simply sitting in the weak winter sunlight the way a person sits when they are very tired and have decided to rest before deciding what comes next. She heard his footsteps on the stone path and looked up. Neither of them spoke for a moment. He sat down on the other end of the bench, leaving a careful space between them. The rose brambles rustled in a slight breeze. Somewhere over the garden wall, a bell was sounding the afternoon hour. "I knew about the ring," she said finally. "I know." "From the 6th week." "I guessed the 6th week," he said. "I thought it might have been the 5th. She looked at him sideways, the ghost of something that was almost a smile. "It was the 4th. The orchard conversation was not my finest performance." He looked at her. "Why didn't you say anything?" She was quiet for a moment, and in that moment he could see her choosing the honest version of the answer over the diplomatic one. "Because you needed someone who didn't know," she said. "And I was the only one in the palace who did know, and could choose to act as if I didn't. That's—" she paused. "That's a very specific kind of gift to give someone. The freedom to be themselves without the weight of what they are. I thought you deserved to have it for as long as possible." He looked at his hands. "You gave up a great deal to give me that. You gave up a great deal to need it." She met his eyes. "I think we are even." He reached into his coat pocket. His fingers closed around the signet ring. He had put it back on that morning, The first time in 17 weeks? He drew it out and held it in his palm between them, the seal of the House of Valkcourt, gold and enamel, the thing that had started everything. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. "I have a question," he said, "and I've had it for a long time, and I'd like to ask it properly." "You may ask it," she said. "You loved me before you knew what this was." He closed his fingers around the ring, then set it in his pocket again. "I want to know if you will love me, in spite of what it is. Being beside a king is not the same as walking through a village orchard. The weight doesn't go away. The decisions don't get easier." He held her gaze. "You have seen me as an ordinary man. I need to know if you can also live beside me as what I actually am." Serafina was quiet for a long moment. The afternoon light was getting lower. "You know what I was doing," she said, "the first time you saw me, in the market at Hawthorne Crossing. Helping an elderly village elder navigate a public inspection. I was doing my job," she said, "the same job I have done for every village and every person and every small injustice I have been in a position to address since I was 17 years old, and realized that I could either use the position I was born into to make things slightly better, or I could treat it as the arrangement of my life, rather than the work of it." She looked at him steadily. "I know what being beside a crown means. I have been beside one my entire life. I am not afraid of the weight. I am asking only that you let me share it honestly." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up from the bench, and he reached into the breast pocket of his morning coat. Not the signet ring pocket, the other one. And he drew out a small velvet case that the Kingswell royal jeweler had placed there at his request, before the funeral, because he had known, with the same certainty he had felt on the mountain road, that if the opportunity came, he did not want to let it pass through unreadiness. He opened the case. Inside was a ring that had been worn by 5 queens of Kingswell, passed down through the House of Valcourt for 200 years, a sapphire the color of the sky at the end of a very long autumn day, set in gold work so fine it looked more like weaving than metalwork. He held it out. Serafina looked at the ring. She looked at him. Something in her expression changed. Not surprise, exactly, but the movement of a face when it receives the confirmation of something it had almost stopped hoping for. "Princess Serafina of Everley," he said, "you chose to give me freedom when you could have claimed advantage. You protected me when you owed me nothing. You loved the man before you knew the position, and you were honest about both." He held her gaze. "Will you be my wife and my queen and the partner of everything that follows?" She reached out and took the ring from the case herself. She held it for a moment, turning it once in the light. "Yes," she said, "but I have a condition." He blinked. "A condition." "The bridge on the North Road in Millhaven," she said. "I was right about the structural assessment. I want to be in the room when infrastructure decisions are made." For a moment, he simply looked at her. Then he laughed. It was a genuine laugh, the full kind, the kind that surprised him on its way out, and it echoed off the old stone walls of the garden, and the rose brambles shook slightly in a breeze, and she was smiling at him with the particular smile he had first noticed on a cold morning in a village square, the smile that was the same whether anyone was watching or not. "Deal," he said. She put the ring on her own finger and held out her hand. He took it. The wedding of Prince Lucian Valcourt and Princess Serafina of Everley took place on the first day of spring, in the great cathedral of Kingswell, before 3,000 people, and the first warm sunlight the kingdom had seen in months. Seraphina wore the traditional Kingswell white with a silver thread at the cuffs that matched the embroidery on Lucian's ceremonial robes. They had argued about the menu for the celebration dinner for 2 weeks. She felt strongly about including dishes from Everley. He felt strongly about the traditional Kingswell spread. They had compromised by having both, and the argument had been conducted with the cheerful mutual obstinacy of two people who had already figured out that they were going to be arguing productively for the rest of their lives. The coronation came 3 weeks later. Lucian knelt before the assembled nobility of Kingswell and received the crown that had sat in the royal vault since his father's death. When he rose, he turned to the hall, and beside him stood Seraphina, not in the position of a woman waiting to be recognized, but in the position of a person who had already rolled up her sleeves and was ready to work. In the gallery of visiting dignitaries, King Alaric watched his daughter stand beside the new king of Kingswell. He thought about the study, and the offer she had made, and the way her voice had not trembled when she made it. He thought about what he had nearly protected her from, and what he had nearly protected her into, and the difference between those two things. Captain Aldrich Fenn was reinstated in the Everley Palace Guard 3 months after the wedding, at the request of the new Queen Seraphina, who had submitted the formal petition herself. He served without incident for 11 more years. He never told anyone the full story of what had happened. He did not need to. Everyone who needed to know already did. Prince Cedric Thornfield returned to Thornfield and eventually contracted a politically useful marriage with a noblewoman of his father's choosing. The marriage was, by all accounts, successful in the ways that politically useful marriages are sometimes successful. He became a competent administrator and a cautious statesman. People who knew him remarked, in later years, that he had grown more careful about the assumptions he made before he acted on them. He never explained why. In the villages west of Velmoor, and in the northern provinces of Kingswell, and along the road that ran between the two kingdoms, ordinary people noticed that things changed in small ways and continued changing. Schools received funding that had been promised for years and not delivered. A hospital was built in a district that had not had a physician within traveling distance. A bridge was repaired properly, on schedule, by engineers who had been told very specifically what to do, and had the paperwork to prove it. The orders came from 2 crowns that had found a way to speak to each other in the same language. On a morning 3 years after the coronation, Seraphina stood in the window of the Royal Library in Kingswell, reading a report on the northern harvest, with a cup of tea going cold beside her because she had gotten too interested in the figures to remember to drink it. Lucian passed through on his way to a meeting, stopped, looked at the cold tea, and went to the kitchen himself to get her a hot one, because the steward was busy, and it was not a complicated errand, and she was going to have an opinion about the northern harvest figures, and he wanted her mind fully operational when they discussed it. He set the cup beside her without interrupting her reading. She put her hand briefly over his without looking up. He went to his meeting. This was what their life looked like. Not the crown first, then the people. The people first, always. And the crown simply the name they had given to the responsibility of doing that well. Some people said Queen Seraphina was the most effective advocate for ordinary citizens that Kingswell had seen in 2 generations. Some people said King Lucian was the most just-minded ruler the kingdom had produced since his great-grandmother. Both of these things were true. They were also both beside the point. The point, as anyone who knew them eventually came to understand, was not that they wore the crown well. The point was that they had been exactly who they were before they wore it. The rest followed from that, as all important things do. There is a kind of love that survives the revelation of the truth. And there is a kind of love that is built from the truth itself. Love that chooses clearly, without the softening of mystery or the excitement of discovery. Love that looks at a person completely and says, yes, this, all of it, even the weight, even the difficulty, even the bridge on the North Road that needs fixing. That second kind is rarer. It is also the only kind that lasts. A crown can be given or taken. A title can be stripped or granted in an afternoon. But the choice to see another person fully and say yes anyway, that belongs to no one and nothing except the person who makes it. And it cannot be bought, inherited, or negotiated. It can only ever be freely given. That is what it means to deserve one.